Hello, you are listening to the Natural Healing Show for UK Health Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Carrigan, medical intuitive healer, Amazon #1 bestselling author. You can find out more about me and my work at catherinecarrigan.com and unlimitedenergynow.com. While you're there, definitely sign up for my newsletter so you can learn even more about how you can heal yourself naturally. Now, our guest today is Jennie Weaver. Jennie Weaver is a family nurse practitioner and the co-author with her sister of a new book, Healing Begins With Us, Breaking the Cycle of Trauma and Abuse and Rebuilding the Sibling Bond. You can find out more about Jennie Weaver and her wonderful work at her website, ronnieandjennie.com. Welcome, Jennie Weaver.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
So, Jennie Weaver, you have written a book with your sister about overcoming abuse and trauma. Why did you feel called to write this book?
It came after many years of working our recovery together. My sister is a sociologist, and her studies are in family dynamics. And so it's something that we, even though, we both went into helping professions, our coming out of denial of growing up in a family with these issues evolved and started really in our early to mid 20s, as we began to get married and both started to have children. We started looking at how we were raised and how we wanted to parent, and realized that there were many things about how we were raised that we did not want to repeat. And it came from our discussions and starting to really open up and talk to each other honestly, that we started to peel away some of the layers of denial.
And I think that many people listening to this show can relate to that, where you start to become a parent yourself and you think, how do I want to do this differently? Now, what do you mean when you use the word childhood trauma? Because that can mean many things to all kinds of people.
It can. And there are 9 different what are called adverse childhood experiences that have been really talked more about over the last decade, but the research has been going on for the last approximately 30 years. And it can be physical abuse, it can be neglect, it can be addiction, of course, sexual abuse, the loss of a parent, imprisonment of a parent. So there's a whole list of adverse childhood experiences that are considered traumatic. And in our family, we had 5 and were borderline for a couple of others. So we grew up in a home with addiction, abuse issues, and mental illness. And of course, when you're born into a family like this, you are pigeonholed into roles. My role was the scapegoat. I was the youngest of 3. Ronnie was the oldest. She was the hero. And so what those roles mean for a child that's a hero, basically all of the family expectations for success, and striving for goodness are hung on the shoulders of the hero. And part of that is so that the family can say, there's nothing wrong with us here, because we have this wonderful hero child that they typically excel in academics, they excel in arts and sports, whatever it is that the family expectations are, typically the parents, and they're expected to be darn near perfect. The scapegoat, on the other hand, is the child that is pigeonholed to be the family problem. And in a therapeutic world, the therapist would identify that as the identified patient of the family, of addicted, abusive family, and say, well, gee, everything would be just fine if this scapegoat child would just get their act together. If they could just quit being such a failure, such a mess, then everything would be okay. So regardless of what area of the world you live in. If you grow up in a home where there's addiction and abuse, there will be a hero and a scapegoat. And sadly, for some of those families, if there's an only child, then that only child will literally be flip-flopping between playing the hero role for the parents and playing the scapegoat.
So Jennie Weaver, let's go back for our audience, because I know that there's something called the Holmes and Ray stress scale. And often when I'm working with a client who's gone through maybe even decades of stress, I have them go to Wikipedia and look up the Holmes and Ray stress scale and actually calibrate out how many stressful events they have been through in the past year. And one of the things that we know is that the more stressful events that you've been through in the past year, the higher the likelihood that you will experience some sort of physical illness. So, and in the Holmes and Ray stress scale, the top of the list is death of a child, divorce, death of a spouse, moving, other things, violations of the law, and so on. But what's interesting about the Holmes and Ray stress scale, it's for adults. And it doesn't include a lot of the common experiences that children go through. So will you, for our audience, list out precisely what are the 9 different adverse childhood experiences that our audience may have experienced? You mentioned a few of them.
Yeah, so it talks about neglect, and that can be emotional neglect. It talks about addiction, mental illness, incarceration of a parent, death of a parent, divorce of a parent, and it's interesting when they're talking about the research about adverse childhood experiences, it's also talking about how this affects these children as they go on through life, and
Yes.
what they are finding is that those that struggle with the adverse childhood experiences end up having many physical ailments, and some of those, of course, are understandable. They may turn to, using substances themselves, smoking, and other addictions, but also things like diabetes, heart disease, and those are also physical ailments that show up from children growing up in a home with these adverse childhood experiences.
Okay, so Jennie Weaver, again, for our audience, and I want to go slow because someone listening to this may want to check off, what did I experience? So list out for us the 9 adverse childhood experiences.
Okay.
Neglect, you said neglect, and this could be emotional or physical, right?
Emotional neglect, physical neglect, mental illness in the home.
Yes.
Death of a parent.
Yep.
Divorce, incarceration of a parent.
Yep. So that's 5.
Sexual abuse.
Yes.
Sorry, I didn't have a list ready. I didn't realize that was.
Yes. Sexual abuse. So we've got neglect, emotional or physical, mental illness in the home, death of a parent, divorce, incarceration of a parent, sexual abuse. Okay, so that's 6. So what are the other 3 that our audience may have experienced?
I'll pull them up for you.
That's okay. So again, if you're listening to this and you're wanting to understand, what is the psycho-spiritual causes of my long-term chronic illness, a really good place to start is actually with your childhood experience. And the research that I have read shows that, and this is similar but different, that by the time you're in your mid-30s, if you can self-report, if you can say to yourself, I felt loved as a child by both of my parents, then you're going to be pretty physically healthy. If, on the other hand, you can say, well, one of my parents loved me, but the other one didn't, then you're going to have more health issues. But if you can self-report and say, you know, I really didn't feel loved as a child by either one of my parents, then those people are likely to experience chronic long-term health issues. So what
Yes.
else did you find for our audience that they may self-reflect about what they went through?
Yeah, the adverse childhood experiences are broken out as physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse. So they're breaking them out separately. Physical abuse, 5 is emotional neglect, 6 is mental illness, 7 is an incarcerated parent or close relative, 8 is a mother treated violently, so abuse between the parents where a mother is abused.
So domestic violence.
Yes.
Yes.
The home, yes. 9 is substance abuse, and 10 is divorce or death of a parent.
Okay, so that's actually 10, right?
Yeah. Yes. Excuse
Okay.
me.
Right. So again, let's talk about our audience for a moment. So Jennie Weaver, this author of a book about overcoming childhood abuse, if someone's listening to this broadcast and they can identify that they have gone through some of these experiences, what would your advice be to a person who's had mental illness in the home, death of a parent, divorce, incarceration of a parent, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, physical abuse, or domestic violence in the home?
Well, I think it's really important to educate yourself. I know in the early years, Ronnie and I read so many books, reading other people's stories, their stories of healing, their stories of recovery were very helpful to us. Certainly going to sites like the CDC, you know, and other sites to read about adverse childhood experiences and how it affects your health. And it's very important early on to find a very good counselor who is trained in the issues that you are facing. Unfortunately, it is not required for counselors to be trained in addiction, abuse, and so you can end up working with a counselor who may not understand the dynamics and the trauma that you've experienced. And so it's really important, I believe, to know on the front end and ask the counselor, are you trained in abuse, addiction, mental illness, you know, issues, if whatever the issues are that you are trying to sort through and unpack, because it's I believe imperative that they are well knowledged, you know, and well trained and very knowledgeable in these issues that you are seeking healing in.
Right. Now, another resource, because we're talking about childhood adverse experiences that our audience may want to turn to, you can Google the Wheel of Power and Control. The Wheel of Power and Control. And this goes over 8 different ways that a person can experience abuse. And I myself spent 2 years in a support group for battered women in Nashville, Tennessee, which is, I know where you have your practice, your family nurse practitioner practice. But that wheel of power and control is another method that people can look at through ways that they may have been abused in the past so that they can begin to heal from what they experienced. So you and your sister experienced some of these childhood experiences. So you mentioned alcoholism and emotional neglect. What did you all experience?
We talk about the physical abuse, the emotional, psychological abuse, the addiction, the mental illness of our parents in the book, more along the lines of talking about how it felt and how it tends to isolate even the siblings from each other. And what motivated us to write a book together was that we realized, after searching about the sibling relationships and how they're affected, there really isn't a lot of discussion about that. And we through going through the attempt to get our father to go to treatment, over 25 years ago. The intervention counselors were very surprised that my sister and I had developed this incredibly strong friendship and bond, and we were actually helping each other to work through our recovery process, because typically the hero and the scapegoat are never friends, and they do not love and support each other as we were. And so we've thought that that was really sad, because we felt like our relationship just incredibly accelerated our healing process for each other. We were there to validate each other's experiences, validate each other's memories. And it when you are in the early stages of your recovery, you're basically dismantling your whole identity, because all this time you have been indoctrinated into thinking, I'm this is what my family has told me I am. And yet there's this battle inside you saying, no, that doesn't feel right, and it doesn't feel good. And so we felt that it was really important to talk about how growing up with these adverse childhood experiences really affect the sibling relationships, and typically for life. Typically, scapegoats and heroes are at odds for life. And so we felt it was really important to try to share our story and our healing recovery process, because we felt if more siblings could reach out to each other, it would drastically help improve their individual and collective healing process.
So with that, let's listen to a message from one of our commercial sponsors here at UK Health Radio, and we'll be right back to learn more about overcoming childhood abuse. So Jennie Weaver, co-author of Healing Begins With Us, Breaking the Cycle of Trauma and Abuse and Rebuilding the Sibling Bond. You mentioned hero and scapegoat, which are two of actually several possible childhood roles. And I would like to share for our audience my perspective from my 29 years in experience in natural healing, because you may be listening to this and go, I was never the hero, and yet I was never the scapegoat. So let me kind of go through these from my perspective. So the family hero receives primarily only positive attention and positive energy. The scapegoat, on the other hand, receives negative energies. The scapegoat is literally the repository of all the family. It's almost like the family negativity gets directed at that person. So Jennie Weaver, you mentioned that you felt you had been the scapegoat. So I'm really sorry for that. But in addition to the hero and the scapegoat, another possible role that you may identify with is the mascot or clown. So these are, like the funny people in the family. And the mascot and the clown may receive both either positive or negative attention. And then, of course, there's the addict. And the addict, because everybody's walking on eggshells around them. And finally, there's the enabler. So there's possible roles. And I feel in my work as a medical intuitive healer, I do a lot of work actually clearing these fundamental roles, because you may have played this role in your family of origin, but it's learned behavior. It's a learned way of how you interact with energy in the world. So if you were the hero as a child, you're more than likely going to be a hero at work. And if you were the scapegoat as a child, you're going to be the scapegoat at work. And it's so critical, and in every part of your life, that if you realize that this is the survival role that you learned, that you do the inner work so you can clear that, so that you can show up in the world as your true self and not be constantly receiving the abuse of everyone around you. So Jennie Weaver, any comments about these other roles? Because again, hero and scapegoat are not the only roles that a person who grew up in adverse circumstances may have experienced.
Oh, absolutely. We had a brother who was the invisible child. He didn't make any waves. He tried not to draw attention to himself. And then it was in my teenage years, really around the age of 14, that I learned through friends at school how to use humor to diffuse tension. And so I would definitely use humor in the home to diffuse tension. So I started taking on some of this, not just the scapegoat, but some of the mascot behaviors, and that helped, through the teenage years and into our 20s, until we eventually sadly had to break contact with some of our family members. And that was in part their choice. We had to move on and to try to create the healthiest families that we could for ourselves, for our children. And so that was sadly the only option that was available after we exhausted every other option. Yeah.
Now, from your research, what is the health impact, both physical and mental, emotional impact of experiencing childhood trauma?
The health impact is certainly in the research out there, is certainly very clear. A lot of chronic pain, migraine headaches, back pain, neck pain. And I mentioned, the heart disease, diabetes, obesity. Those are physical, side effects, if you will, of growing up with adverse childhood experiences. So it's been well documented, certainly, and is talked about on the CDC website.
Yes, and the mental, emotional, chronic depression, chronic anxiety.
Absolutely.
Psychological is profound.
It is.
I have to say for myself that in my family of origin, I was a scapegoat. And I'll never forget, probably 20 years ago, receiving a healing to complete the cycle of playing the role of a scapegoat. And it was worth 20 years of talk therapy, because you can talk about something, but if you have to understand these roles are learned behavior. And there are ways that you have learned to deal with energy in the world. And when you are doing these roles, you're not showing up as your true self. So there's survival roles.
Absolutely. You're when you grow up with those kinds of conditions, you're really living in a state of hypervigilance. And it's like I've said before, it's like your basic personality gets hijacked, and you get pigeonholed into these roles that you are expected to play. And it takes, one counselor once told us, a woman that was, that when we were attempting the intervention with our father, she said, if it took you 25 years to get to this point, it's going to take you 25 years to unravel, and peel away the layers of denial. And that's really why we wrote our book, because it's not just starting off with the mental health counseling. I think is imperative to intellectually understand what happened to you and how it affected you. But there are other layers of rediscovering who you are and learning to trust your own inner guidance, your inner wisdom, your intuition, because for years you were told nothing's wrong here, you're the one that has the problem, right? And then there's the whole spiritual side of it, and the energy side, as you're talking, to me, I call that the spiritual side, and that's the healing, the energetic side of it. And we talk about that also in our book, about just giving ourselves permission to pursue Reiki healing and other energy healings and things that we felt called to help us move on to that next level of healing. And it really is an ongoing process of becoming more loving, not just with the outer world, but more self-love, more loving of who we are, and accepting of who we are and where we've come from.
So I often, whenever I have clients who grew up or are living in an abusive situation, I strongly recommend they attend abuse recovery support groups. And the YWCA here in the US, the YWCA tends to run free of cost support groups for battered women. And even if you're not currently in an abusive situation, if you realize that you have grown up or lived for a long period of time in an abusive situation, attending these groups can be extremely helpful, because it is extremely difficult often to even look at or remember what actually happened to you. Now, Jennie Weaver, let's move forward and let's talk about, if you realize that someone's listening to this and you've gone through these 10 adverse childhood experiences, how you go about dealing with the parents. So what is your advice for a person who had adverse childhood experiences about how they can develop a healthy relationship with their parent after this?
Well, that's a good question, because I know for me personally, the abuse, the verbal abuse, the psychological, emotional abuse didn't stop when I married, when I began to have children. In my situation, my parents attempted to perpetuate the dynamics, and they chose a hero with my firstborn and my secondborn as a scapegoat. And so by the age of 2, the more counseling, the more spiritual counseling, the more I tried to become healthy, to have limited, even start to limit interactions, to not allow them to have my children alone. The healthier I tried to become, the more they spiraled out of control. And that's not uncommon when you are dealing with abusive relationships. And for some people, if you can't agree on what the problems are in the relationship, it's really difficult to reconcile. It's really difficult to heal that. You either have one of two choices. You either try to be as healthy as you can while staying in the midst of an abusive relationship, or as I chose, you realize that I wasn't going to be able to be healthy. I wasn't going to be able to fully heal, nor was I going to be able to protect my children from the ugly things that were being said to them, even in my presence, even when I was there. I could not prevent the abuse, the verbal abuse, from happening. So I had no choice but to step out of range and stay out of range. Now, it wasn't pretty when I finally made that decision. And Ronnie also, my sister, supported me in that. We both had to make that decision. And there was a spiraling out of control. There was an escalation of rage from our parents because of that. But we knew that that was what was necessary in order to protect ourselves, but even more importantly, at the time, I felt, to protect my children. So in order for healing to occur, both parties have to agree that there's a problem when you're talking about abuse. And if the abuser, and oftentimes they will not admit any fault or guilt. And so it's a tough decision that you have to make. And many women and men as well, battered partners, have to make that very difficult decision.
So with that, let's take another break and listen to a message from one of our commercial sponsors here at UK Health Radio, and we'll be right back with Jennie Weaver, author of Healing Begins With Us. So Jennie Weaver, co-author of Healing Begins With Us. Here at the Natural Healing Show for UK Health Radio, the most popular interview of all time that I have personally done is an interview with a gentleman named H.G. Tudor, who's an avowed narcissist. And my interview with him was titled, Why Narcissists Can't Be Healed. Why Narcissists Can't Be Healed. And part of it, I think that when we're talking about childhood, overcoming childhood trauma and beginning to heal our relationship with our parents, I think it's also important to begin to recognize when you can and cannot heal that relationship. So Jennie Weaver, in your professional opinion, when is it healthy or okay to cut off an abusive parent?
I think it's okay for anyone to protect themselves. And I don't think that there certainly is a lot of pressure from society to maintain a relationship, a limited relationship. Can't you send Christmas cards or get together briefly for holidays? And my answer is, how much abuse is okay? How much abuse is okay for yourself and for your children? And in my heart, it is never okay to allow yourself to be abused or allow your children to be abused, to knowingly walk into a situation where you know injury is going to occur. And so everyone has to make that decision for themselves. I certainly didn't come to that, rashly or quickly. It certainly took me time to sort through that. And I felt, for me, I had to exhaust every avenue. I sought spiritual counseling, mental health counseling with addiction specialists. I went everywhere trying to say, how can I have limited contact? How can I make this work and still protect my children and protect myself? And in my situation, it wasn't possible. So I think for each person, they have to make that choice. For me, I knew that in order to love myself, to heal myself, and to be the best parent that I could, I needed to step out of range. And my children deserved a better start in life than I had. And I felt like the bare minimum that I could do was protect them as a parent.
So in my work, in 29 years of experience in natural healing, part of what I do is help my clients understand who their parents are or were, if their parents are passed away. And when you really understand that someone is a narcissist, and usually narcissists are most likely to be abusive on all these levels, then you have to come to grips with the fact that this is who this person is, and they're not going to be able to change. And so it's the first step is understanding who your parent is or was. The second step is accepting them. You may not like who they are. And then once you really understand who they actually are, then the third step is to have a choice about how you want to interact with that person in the future. And for many of my clients, they may need to actually divorce their parents. And I've had other narcissist experts on the show, and they talk about this. This person cannot be healed, and your healing process may not begin until you set up healthy boundaries with an abusive narcissistic parent. So, Jennie Weaver, what is your professional advice about how can someone establish healthy boundaries with an abusive parent?
Well, you certainly have to tell them what your boundaries are, which I did. I tried that verbally. I tried writing out a letter of what my boundaries were. Unfortunately, they didn't respect any of that. And then you just have to in my situation, I said, then, if we can't agree on what the problems are in our family, other than blaming me for everything, then I have no choice but to step out of range and stay out of range. And those were pretty much the words I used. I don't hate you. I have certainly forgiven them as much as is humanly possible. But I will not go back for more. And that's pretty much what I had to say to them. Through the years, my sister and I at different times have thought, well, we haven't received any hate mail. We have, any of those kinds of things that they would do. So maybe we could just try a brief visit, but it deteriorated into, we were dead to them. We were no longer their daughters, get out of their house and never come back. And a whole lot of yelling and screaming and cursing on their end. So it was pretty clear. This was not something that we could fix or go back to and even have the most limited of contact with. So I think you have to be at peace with that and understand that you deserve to be loved and nurtured and whole as a human being, as a soul. And in our case, our children deserved to have a better start in life than we had.
I'm so sorry for what you and your sister went through. And again, I'm sure that many people listening to this broadcast can relate also to that. And again, it's my experience as a medical intuitive healer that you may not be able to actually begin true healing until you set up these healthy boundaries.
Oh, absolutely.
And you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely.
Because as long as you continue to allow yourself to be abused, you're going to continue to have depression, anxiety, and a whole myriad of mental and physical health problems. Yes,
absolutely. And I know, I can speak from experience that I struggled from depression that started at age 8. That was the first time that I remembered laying in bed and asking God to let me die. And certainly those cycles of depression had drastically improved through the years, through separation and removing myself from that environment, but also just living a life and thriving and having the energy, for one thing, to pursue things that make you happy, that give you joy. When you're in the middle of that kind of a relationship, you're constantly in that hypervigilant fight or flight survival mode, which is what I grew up with. And you don't know any different until you start to get a taste of healing, until you start to make steps in that direction of starting to value yourself, love yourself. And when you do, you find there's so much more to life than you realized, and that you deserve to have hobbies or interests or things that you didn't have the energy to invest in when you were stuck in that hypervigilant fight or flight survival mode. Yes.
And a couple of comments. I think that if you're listening to this broadcast and you realize, gosh, I was a family scapegoat, then realize that literally it's not just your negativity, the negativity of the family has been directed at you. And on some soul level, you've agreed to accept that. Now, you mentioned something earlier. I am a Reiki master teacher, but that's not actually how I clear these roles. These roles that you have learned are affecting you on every level, physically, energetically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually. And another way of looking at them is that they're actually soul agreements. They are survival roles that you learned as a child, but on some soul level, you agreed to play this role in the family. And as you do that deep inner work to complete the cycle of playing these roles, you can shed that skin and again, show up as your true self in the world. Now, you wrote this book with your sister. How can siblings help each other in healing from childhood trauma?
I think the most important thing is to start talking to each other directly. It's very common in children that grew up with addiction, abuse, mental illness, for there to be isolation from each other, even within the home.
Mhm.
And there's also something that a therapist would call triangular communication. And what that is that all the communication is controlled by one person. And that's, in our family, it was the main codependent, which was our mother. And so we didn't really talk to each other directly. Everything went to her, and then she would twist it, use it, change it, to suit her purposes. And the purposes were always to keep us at odds with each other, to keep us angry with each other or distrustful of each other, so that she could control everyone. And so when Ronnie and I broke that taboo of that family taboo of we started talking to each other, that was when the veil was lifted. And it happened for us over the course of a weekend, when she had invited me to come visit her when her first daughter was 2 and she was teaching, and my first daughter was 8 months old. It was during that weekend that she could tell that I was struggling with depression. And she said, "Jennie, what is wrong? What's going on?" And it just started pouring out. And we started talking to each other so honestly, bluntly. And that was when she said, "Well, you're the family patient. You're the family mess." And I said, "And you're the family golden child." So this was all before we started really doing a lot of our reading and research, but we laid out the whole family dynamics and talked about it that weekend. And it was a great blessing to have her as an ally.
Now, I want to go back for our audience and our listeners. So, are there 9 adverse childhood experiences? These are what I've got. And again, I want to list it out for our audience so you can reflect on your own childhood. Mental illness, death of a parent, divorce, incarceration of a parent, sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, domestic violence in the home, addiction. And was there a 10th one, or did I get them all? There's actually no.
They talked about divorce of parents or death of a parent. So yeah, I think it depends on the list. Some list 10, some list 9. Depends on how they break it out. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So as you and your sister began to heal, what natural healing methods, here we are at the Natural Healing Show, what natural healing methods were most helpful for you in recovering from childhood abuse?
I would say we used a lot of walking in nature, a lot of physical exercise outside, being among trees, being out in nature, meditation and yoga, and those still continue to be very very beneficial for both of us. We went down the path of training with Reiki together. We also have gone through training with expanding our intuition, or tapping into our intuition, with animal communication, and then also working with our soul guides. So it just depends. Everybody is unique, and everybody feels called to different things as part of their spiritual healing. I certainly have I've been to different healing services, laying on of hands, different kind of energy modalities, and so has Ronnie. And oftentimes we try to do these things together as much as we possibly can. So it really, I think it's beneficial to, certainly, I think the intuitive healing that you're talking about is a wonderful avenue. We've both used integrative energy healing modalities. I've read a lot of Carolyn Myss, or my books about the archetypes and the soul contracts. And yeah, so what you're talking about is right up the alley of what Ronnie and I would be very open to and very interested in. Yeah.
Now, many of my clients who've experienced childhood trauma, when they start to do the work, they realized, well, my mom or dad was just doing what happened to them in their childhood. What does it take to overcome intergenerational trauma?
I think it's interesting that you bring that up, because Ronnie and I have certainly talked about that. We certainly feel like everything that we are doing to heal ourselves is helping to heal our ancestral tree. You know, it's helping to heal our generation coming after us, but also any healing that we do, we feel is helping to heal our ancestors. And so, and that's something that we both have felt really guided to work more on. And it's interesting because oftentimes, you know, when you're brought up in that fight or flight mode and hypervigilance, you know, we were not criers. We did not tap into our emotion or let ourselves feel much of anything. And so certainly through doing energy meditations, we have both felt some tremendous releases, and also with Reiki, but with integrative energy therapy sessions, there have been some tremendous energetic releases that we knew that it was, we just intuitively knew that it was connected to our ancestral trauma. And we're very grateful for that. So I think being open and trying to have an open mind to pursue healing through those energy modalities, because they're different, certainly different options out there, has been just a tremendous blessing for us on our healing path.
And I want to point out for our audience, you know, when you think about healing, you think about, okay, I want to heal my issues. And that's a great place to start, because you've got to take ownership and responsibility. And then you begin to look at family patterns and what we're talking about here, and the roles that you may have played and continue to play in your life because you learned them in childhood. And you're like, oh my God, I'm the scapegoat at work, or I'm the invisible child at work, or I'm the clown. So that you all learned that in childhood. But in addition to yourself, your family, there's also your culture. And for example, I'm working with someone and her family came from Vietnam. And so there was a lot of abuse, a lot of misogyny, and it was learned behavior through the culture. So how can we heal cultural trauma? Any thoughts on that?
I really think it comes from the same, I believe it comes from the same place. It's ancestral trauma. And so I believe that the same energy, you know, healing modalities, that whatever we feel called to, I think we are guided in part by our intuition as to what we're ready to release. I certainly have felt that with aura clearing that I've performed on others. And sometimes you'll release a layer of it and find tremendous relief. But then later on, some of that might creep back in, you know, and so it's time to release another layer. And I think it's very similar to lifting the layers of denial, peeling the layers off the onion, right? I think it would be wonderful if we could release all of those ancestral wounds all at once, but I think it also would be overwhelming to the human body, perhaps. And so maybe that's in part why it's been my experience. We tend to release in layers.
I totally agree, like peeling an onion. You've been listening to the Natural Healing Show for UK Health Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Carrigan, medical intuitive healer, Amazon #1 bestselling author. You can find out more about me and my work at catherinecarrigan.com and unlimitedenergynow.com. While you're there, definitely sign up for my newsletter so you can learn even more about how you can heal yourself naturally. Also, if you are interested in the subject of recovering from abuse, please visit my YouTube channel. You can look up Catherine Carrigan on YouTube, and I have an entire playlist of interviews with experts on healing from abuse, and as well as healing techniques that you can use for yourself or others can use with you to heal from abuse. and PTSD and trauma. You've been listening to Jennie Weaver, co-author with her sister, Ronnie Techner, of Healing Begins With Us, Breaking the Cycle of Trauma and Abuse and Rebuilding the Sibling Bond. You can find out more about Jennie Weaver and her wonderful work at her website, ronnieandjennie.com. And thank you so much for listening. And if you have experienced childhood trauma, please be kind and gentle to yourself, but know that you can heal yourself naturally. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.